Hey guys, Britt here. Welcome to End Times Bible Prophecy. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, and share buttons. Well, what happened on July 17th will impact everyone, meaning globally. And we did a video about this a few weeks ago titled, What Will Happen on July 17th? And at the time, I thought that one thing would happen. It turns out a totally different one in a more negative way happened. So what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about something called the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which was a deal brokered by Turkey over a year ago between Russia and Ukraine to free the pathways of the Black Sea, the sea lanes, to ship out valuable grains, agricultural commodities from Ukraine that help feed the world, because Ukraine is a massive exporter of agricultural commodities. And so at the time I thought, well, Russia is just talking about backing out of this deal. They're using some leverage to get some concessions out of the West. But it turns out that that deal actually did fall through. And while the mainstream corporate media isn't talking about the significance of that, we're going to talk about the significance of that today. There was also something else that happened just 3 days later that was just as significant and may portend what worse things to come. So we're going to look at those stories. We're going to talk about how they relate to each other, how they relate to the times in which we live, and Bible prophecy. Because while in the short term, there may not be any end-time Bible prophecy implications to these news stories, I believe there absolutely is in the long term. So we're going to make that connection. So let's start with this article right here from Politico. It's titled, Russia Killed Off the Black Sea Grain Deal. What Happens Now? It says UN brokered deal opened lifeline for Ukraine to export tens of millions of tons of grains and oil seeds. It says Russia on Monday pulled out of the Black Sea. So Monday, this is from July 17th when this happened. It says Russia on Monday pulled out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, a UN brokered accord that has made it possible for Ukraine to export tens of millions of tons of grains and oil seeds over the past year, even as the war rages on. The deal was vital to keep food flowing from Ukraine, a major breadbasket, to the wider world. But Russia, claiming that its own food and fertilizer exports were being hurt by hidden Western sanctions, had already effectively strangled the deal before finally killing it off. Hours later, the Kremlin warned that it could no longer guarantee the safety of shipping in the northwestern Black Sea. Guys, that is a big deal. I cannot underscore that enough. Again, let's repeat that. The Kremlin warned it could no longer guarantee the safety of shipping in the northwestern Black Sea. So even if ships manage to get out, I haven't seen any reports that they have since, but the insurance rates on these ships are going to skyrocket. It's going to raise the cost of shipping these agricultural commodities out. So this is a big deal, and Russia has said it's not just based on their ability to do that, but they see these ships as possible enemy combatant ships, because it's possible that some of these ships have been carrying weapons and were used to attack targets, Russian targets. And so they're seeing these ships as enemy combatants. So what does that mean? So let's read on and see what else it says. Here it talks about the Black Sea Grain Deal and how did it work. We talked a little bit about that, but why did it matter? It says in peacetime, Ukraine produced enough food exports to feed 400 million people. 400 million people. One of the world's largest exporters of wheat and sunflower oil, the country used to ship some 5 million metric tons of grains and oil seeds a month through its Black Sea ports. When this plunged to zero following Russia's invasion, Ukrainian farmers were left with nowhere to store or sell a bumper crop. The impact on global food security was immediate. Net importers like Egypt and Libya were cut off, from up to 2/3 of their supply of cereals, while other countries were hit by a surge in global food prices as markets reacted. The Black Sea Grain Initiative offered a way out. So if you remember, back when Russia first invaded Ukraine, we saw this huge spike over the next couple of months in food, agricultural commodities, as people tended to believe they wouldn't be able to get these shipments, these exports out of Ukraine would be lost. And that really contributed highly to food inflation, food insecurity in a lot of these poorer countries. But when the Black Sea Grain Initiative deal was struck, those exports started flowing again, and we saw those prices come down. They're still elevated from where they were prior to the invasion, but they were nowhere near the highs they had reached immediately following the invasion. So that shows the significance of all this. It says, by last October, Ukraine's grain and oilseeds exports through the Black Sea recovered to 4.2 million metric tons. In total, some 33 million metric tons have been exported under the agreement, sustaining Ukraine's farmers and helping to bring down global food prices, which is what we just talked about. It's putting downward pressure on those global food prices. Believe it or not, even though you and I go to the grocery store, again, we see elevated prices from 3 years ago, but some of the pressure from last year's all-time highs in these commodities has been alleviated by this agreement. So this says, what just happened? Well, despite this, Russia pulled out of the pact, claiming the UN and Western countries have failed to meet its demands for continuing the agreement. We talked about that in the video 3 weeks ago about they were looking to have certain sanctions lifted, have their agricultural bank put back into the SWIFT system. NATO and the West said no. And so I don't know if that would have actually led to this agreement continuing or not. Who knows? But that's where we're at now. It didn't happen. It says, although Western sanctions carve out exemptions for food and fertilizer, and this is key to knowing what's going to happen next. It says the Kremlin argues that sanctions targeting Russian individuals and its state agriculture bank are hindering its own exports, thus contravening a second deal agreed last July under which the UN committed to facilitating these exports for a 3-year period. Moscow had repeatedly threatened to walk away unless these sanctions were removed, and the state agricultural bank readmitted to the SWIFT international payment system. This time, the Kremlin wasn't bluffing. Moscow rejected a compromise proposed by the UN and the EU to create a new unit within the bank that would be allowed to undertake transactions related to grain trading. So what happens now? It says even before Russia finally walked away, the Black Sea Grain Initiative had more or less ground to a halt. The number of shipments had fallen, with only 1.3 million metric tons exported in May. Remember, we just read they said 5 million metric tons per month was the norm before the war began. It says no new vessels have been registered under the initiative since the end of June. Russia's withdrawal from the agreement will therefore not have the same impact as its full-scale invasion in February 2022. Don't be so sure about that. We're going to talk about that a little bit more soon, but it says Russia's de facto ban on Ukrainian shipments meant that commodity markets had been expecting it to quit the agreement. Russia's subsequent warning that it could no longer guarantee the safety of shipping in the northwestern Black Sea raised the stakes, and that is the key, guys. It's one thing to just end the deal. It's another thing to fire upon these ships, threaten to sink these ships. We've seen since this deal ended, almost immediately, I think within days of this ending, Russia bombed silos and storage facilities in the port of Odessa, where many of these ships come from. There were about 60,000 metric tons of grain destroyed in one of those strikes. Again, when we're talking tens of millions of metric tons, that may not seem like a big deal. But that infrastructure, how much of that infrastructure was damaged? And again, when we have a supply chain that's built on shipping these commodities out via shipping lanes and the Black Sea, you can't just turn around and say, oh, well, they're going to go by land now to Europe and get out into the world. And even if the infrastructure is in place to actually do that, it's at a much higher cost, which means that the end product is going to cost more. So this is bad when it comes to food inflation and elevated food prices. Let's read on. It says, responding, Ukrainian President Zelensky said, even without the Russian Federation, everything must be done so that we can use this Black Sea corridor. We are not afraid. Well, you may not be afraid, but what is the reality on the ground? It says, does Ukraine have a plan B? Ukraine has been readying a backup plan to get its grain shipments out without the deal. This hinges in part on a $500 million guarantee to fund to cover any damages or expenses incurred by ships moving through the Black Sea, and in part on shipping more grain out through Europe's Danube River. Before the war, a few 100,000 tons per month were exported via this route versus millions, right? A few 100,000 versus millions. Over the last year, this has increased to 2 million, right? So where's the other 3 million? How's that going to get out? And there's potential to double this figure, it says. Well, okay, if there's the potential to do that, that's great. But again, at what cost? And where's the other million go? Because that's a 20% decline in what was being done before. It says, while Ukraine can continue to export without the Black Sea grain deal, its end will not come without pain. Ukraine's farmers will take a hit, and increased logistical cost mean they will have to sell at a discounted rate, say analysts. So that will hurt the farmers, which means, what does that mean for the next planting season? But again, those increased logistical costs mean that the end consumer is not going to see any relief from those farmers selling at discounted rates. It's going to lead to higher food prices. This goes on. It says, will poor countries go hungry? The Black Sea grain deal has been at the center of a months-long propaganda battle between Moscow and Kiev over who can rightly claim to be feeding the world. Russian President Putin claimed last week that just 3% of Ukrainian exports were going to poor countries. Figures compiled by shipping data platform Kepler, not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, flatly contradict that assertion. Still, any drop in global supplies or volatility on markets, however small, does impact poor countries facing food insecurity. As we talked about, these prices in a global commodity market, they're set at the margin. So just a 1% decrease in availability doesn't necessarily just mean a 1% increase in price. It may mean a 10 or 20% increase in price. So it's a big deal when these supply chains are disrupted and food that is used to getting into the global marketplace can't get there. It says now that the deal is off the table, it's even more urgent to rethink how to feed the world, said aid agency Oxfam, urging more support for small farmers and countries that rely on food imports. So they're saying their solution to this is to give support to small farmers and countries that rely on food imports. But we've talked about how those small farmers are hit by higher cost for fertilizer, which is also part of all of this, what's going on in the Black Sea and the ability to get these things out there, the increased insurance costs. This is going to lead to further inflation of fertilizer prices and food prices in particular, and that does not bode well for the poorer countries of the world, as we've talked about before. And as we read right here, it says, this says, wheat futures prices volatile. Countries face food crises following end of Black Sea grain deal. So now we're going to find out, what does this actually mean? What is this going to do? And this is under a best case scenario, assuming the war doesn't escalate from here. And let's hope that it does not. It says, the lack of access to Ukrainian and Russian grains is an unnecessary shock to 345 million people around the world, and for many countries in the Middle East and North Africa, it will be catastrophic, experts warn. Wheat futures prices have risen sharply, and many countries, especially in the Middle East and North Africa, are facing severe food crisis following the falling apart of the Black Sea Grain Initiative last week. Last Wednesday, June 19th, saw the largest single-day increase in wheat prices since the start of the war in Ukraine, a senior spokeswoman and regional communications officer for the Middle East and North Africa at the United Nations World Food Program told the Media Line. The WFP would welcome a resumption of negotiations between the parties. She said the suspension of the Black Sea Initiative is an unnecessary shock for the 345 million acutely food insecure people around the world. So we talked about this a number of times, guys. We talked about this coming into this year, that this would be one of the big events on the horizon. We talked a year ago about the implications of all of this and how fragile this agricultural supply chain was. And now we're witnessing that. And we talked about this isn't going to be an evenly distributed crisis, even though it does affect every person on the planet, because we're going to see elevated food prices everywhere. And we're going to get into more why here with some of these additional stories that we look at. But we've talked in the past about the poorer countries. They're going to get outbid by other countries that are wealthier and import a lot of food, such as Japan, China, South Korea, European countries. They have the ability to bid up these food prices that the lower income earning per capita countries just simply cannot compete with. And so while the food may exist to feed everyone in the world, that doesn't mean it will get to everyone in the world. And if you live in one of these wealthier countries, that there's probably going to be food available at your local grocery store, but at what price? Is it going to be twice the price it is today, a year from now? We don't know, but that's why this is significant. So let's read on. It says, EFTA said that over the past year, more than 32 million metric tons of grain and foodstuffs have been moved to 45 countries as part of the deal. This helped bring down global food prices, with the benefits felt all across the world, both in countries that directly received Ukrainian foodstuffs and those that benefited from lower food prices. She said that the 24 WFP chartered vessels had sailed under the initiative while it was in force, carrying grains and foodstuffs to relieve hunger in some of the world's hardest hit areas, especially the Horn of Africa, Afghanistan, and Yemen. And now those ships won't be sailing. So what does that mean for those areas? El-Hada Abdallah Mohammed, international coordinator for the Sudan Call Humanitarian Initiative, told the Media Line that the Middle East and North Africa region was one of the most heavily affected by the halting of the agreement. He said that in 2021, before the Russia invasion, the MENA region imported over 36 million metric tons of grains, mainly from Russia and Ukraine. He said the two countries together produced over 20% of the world's grains. Think of that. We've got two nations in conflict, and a conflict that could escalate at any moment, and they are responsible for producing 20% of the world's grains. It says with their exports mainly going to the MENA countries, the lack of Russian and Ukrainian grains has a catastrophic impact on the MENA region. Again, MENA is Middle East and North Africa, in terms of food security, food prices, and humanitarian needs, as well as on their economies. He said that 20 to 25% of the world's most food insecure populations are in MENA countries, and that Egypt is the world's largest grain importer and therefore one of the hardest hit by the lack of Russian and Ukraine grains. And if you remember, the government of Egypt was toppled over a decade ago during the Arab Spring, which began because of elevated food prices and social unrest and riots in the streets. So we may be looking at a repeat of that in some of these nations. Mohammed said that other countries also expected to be badly affected are Yemen, Sudan, Libya, Syria, and Lebanon. This is due to their expanding humanitarian crisis and the increase in the number of affected populations in need of humanitarian assistance. In Sudan, the UN estimates that 25 million people, more than half the country's population, needs assistance. A spike in grain prices means a higher cost of food products for people who have been hit by shock after shock over the last few years. Conflicts, climate extremes, the COVID pandemic, a global economic slowdown, and high rates of domestic food price inflation. And guys, that's everybody. That's talking about everybody in the world has been hit by shock after shock, wave after wave of these inflating food prices. And if you live in a place like the United States, like I do, then the food is available. But as we all know, you go to the store and it's at a much higher price than it was a year ago, 2 years ago, and 3 years ago. And unfortunately, it looks like that's going to continue, because it's not just what we're seeing with the Black Sea Grain Initiative. That's that deal failing with Russia threatening ships in the Black Sea and bombing the port of Odessa and grain storage facilities. That's bad enough. But then we also had, just a few days after the end of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, we had this story pop up. So it says, India cuts rice exports, triggering panic buying of food staple by some Indian expatriates in the United States. So on July 20th, India, because of poor weather conditions, is looking at a possible shortfall in rice production. And so they instituted an export ban on certain types of rice. We'll read a little bit more about that here. But that's going to have a major impact on rice. So we have corn, wheat, and rice, three of the major backbone grains of the world food system for humans, have been affected in a major way just in the last couple of weeks. And this has yet to filter down into prices at the stores, but I believe it will, and it's going to have major impacts. So let's read on about this. It says, chatter on one of Prabha Rao's WhatsApp groups exploded last week when India announced it was severely curtailing some rice exports to the rest of the world, triggering worry among the Indian diaspora in the United States that access to a food staple from home might soon be cut off. As in any crisis situation, think bottled water and toilet paper, some rushed to supermarkets to stock up, stacking carts with bags and bags of rice. In some places, lines formed outside some stores as panic buying ensued. But Rao, who lives near Syracuse, New York, was reassured when the proprietor of her Indian market sent out an email to customers to let them know there was no need to worry. There was ample supply of rice, at least for now. And again, I would note that will probably continue. There will probably be ample supply of rice, but again, at what price? So I think some of the people who understood this, who have rice as a staple part of their diet, they understood the implications of this, and that's why they were running out. And it wasn't necessarily that they thought there would be no rice, but I better buy it now and store it away so that I don't have to pay twice as much or 3 times as much 6 months, 8 months down the road. And so they were piling that up, hoarding it, I guess you could say, storing it away, preparing. But that's what was going on. And I know many of you have seen probably images of some fights broke out in some of these stores. But it says an earlier than expected El Nino brought drier, warmer weather in some parts of Asia and is expected to harm rice production. But in some parts of India, where the monsoon season was especially brutal, flooding destroyed some crops, adding to production woes and rising prices. Hoping to stave off inflationary pressures on a diet staple, the Indian government earlier this month imposed export bans on non-basmati white rice varieties, prompting hoarding in some parts of the world. The move was taken to ensure adequate availability and to allay the rise and prices in the domestic market, India's Ministry of Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution announced on July 20th. Over the past year, prices have increased by more than 11% and by 3% over the past month, the government said. Non-basmati white rice constitutes about 1/4 of the rice exported by India. Guys, India is responsible for 40% of the world's rice exports. So while this is only 1/4 of what they export, that is equal to 10% of all world exports. And the question here that we need to ask is, what happens next? Because if we continue to see this rise in prices or the weather gets even worse, does that become a total ban on rice exports? Which would mean 40% of the world's rice exports disappear, they go away. What happens if other countries that are also exporters of rice, exporters of wheat, exporters of corn, exporters of soybeans, what if they decide, well, we don't want social unrest in our country, we don't want an Arab Spring here due to high prices, so we're going to ban exports as well? Where does all that lead? So, guys, what does all this mean right now? Let's take a look at some of the futures charts. Here we have a picture of wheat futures from the NASDAQ. And this goes back, a decade or so, and we can see we had this huge spike 3 months after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So we're well off of what the highs were, down 45% probably from that all-time high. But we're still way elevated compared to the previous years. Pretty much the same thing with corn here. So obviously well down from the highs following the invasion, but not markedly down and still much higher than we saw in the past. And then we have rice, very similar. So, oops, let me hit the max on that because that's only given us a few days. Down from the highs that we saw here from earlier in the year, but we're still much higher than we were in the, say, rolling 5-year average prior to this export ban. What does this mean going forward? What happens if we see an escalation of the war in Ukraine? What does that mean for global food supplies? So again, if other countries decide to follow India's lead and protect their domestic pricing by banning exports, or at least making that political decision that they think will do that, because the free market's the free market, it's a global market, but they're going to be put under pressure to do that by their home population and the politicians. What else are they going to do? So we're going to see banning of these exports, and we talked about this over a year ago. But what does all of this mean? What does this mean? Well, I think exactly what we said it means. It means these poorer countries, these countries that are facing food insecurity, it's going to get really bad. We may be looking at famine in many of those countries, just a crisis, a humanitarian crisis. And then we're going to see elevated food prices all across the globe in grocery stores, even more so than what we see now. So we've been advocating for a long time, ever since this channel came into existence, have a deep pantry. One of the best investments you can make, instead of going and buying some high-flying stock and hoping that doubles, why not buy a can of food with a long shelf life? Odds are it'll cost double a year or two down the road. That's a better investment than any other investment you can make, and you can eat it, and you need to be able to eat, right? So, there's really no downside. Do you really think that the prices will drop 50% in a year? I don't think there's any chance of that. So make sure that you have a deep pantry, if at all possible. Make sure that you look out for your friends and neighbors. Make sure that you look out for your local food bank. any charities that you know that can serve some of these food insecure countries. We need to be helping our neighbors. We need to be the good Samaritans and be the light of Christ to those around us. But guys, how does this all tie into the end times and Bible prophecy? In the short term, it may not. I don't know what's going to come of all this. Just like when we did the video 3 weeks, I didn't know what for sure would happen on July 17th. I thought there was probably a 95% chance that the deal would be extended and that Russia would receive some sort of concessions in response for that. But instead, we saw the exact opposite. So I don't know what's coming in the immediate future, but I think what this shows us, if we look at Revelation chapter 6, we see an outbreak of global war, and that's followed by a period of massive food inflation where we see entire days' wages is not just enough to basically buy enough food to survive for another day. So think about when that was written. When that was written, if you had a famine in a part of the Roman Empire, that didn't affect food prices or availability in South America or in China or in South and in western parts of Africa. It just really had no impact. That was a local impact. But we today live in a world of global supply chains, very fragile global supply chains we've learned over the past 3 years, where disruptions like what we're seeing can have a catastrophic impact, and they can do so on a global scale. We have global pricing of these global commodities. This is the world we're dealing with. And so you can envision a scenario, as we see in Revelation 6, transpiring a global war followed by this global food inflation with, I'm sure, famine involved in that. And so what previous generations could really look to that and point to that? But our generation can, along with all the other signs Jesus said to look for. And he said, when you begin to see these signs, look up, your salvation draws near. Guys, that's the message to take away. A message of hope that while all of this is going on and it appears to be bad news, the good news is Jesus could come back at any moment. So make sure you're prepared for that. Make sure you're spreading that message to other people and telling them about the hope that they can have in Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. So guys, what do you think? What do you think is going to happen from all of this? Do you think this will cause more food inflation? I know it's a tough topic to talk about because, again, we're all impacted by this. This isn't some abstract idea. This is breaking household budgets. It's leading to people having to skip meals all over the world, and it's leading to some people in absolute desperation. So we need to be thinking of ways that we can help those around us and be a good neighbor. So let me know what you think. Leave your comments below. Make sure to hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. When you do that, more people see these videos and hear about the hope that we can have in Jesus Christ. So, God willing, I will see you on Friday. Bye. If you want to learn more about the end times and Bible prophecy, make sure to sign up for my free monthly newsletter and get your copy of my free ebook, 7 Signs of the End Times. Just follow the link in the description to get your free book. Also, make sure to check out all of my books. Just look up Britt on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple iBooks, Google Books, Kobo, or anywhere books are sold. Thanks for watching today, and until next time, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith.